Morning, everyone. Welcome to the Day 3 keynote. We're going to have lots of awesome announcements. I'm Taith Motti, and I'm an ASP.NET MVP, an ASP.NET Insider, and a senior consultant for Redify back in Australia. And this is my partner in crime, Damien Edwards.
Yes. Until recently, I was also a senior consultant at Redify and an ASP.NET MVP, but I now work for Microsoft in Seattle as of 6 weeks ago. So I have been assimilated, everyone tells me.
So our focus is working on large public websites. As a consultant, we move around a number of different clients, and the session today is about some of the lessons we've learned on real-world projects and turning that into a series of things that you can very easily go through and know what to be aware of. The project in particular that we're talking about today is graysonline.com. This is one of the largest e-commerce sites in Australia. It's a business-to-consumer auction site, so say a business goes bankrupt, they go and auction it all off. And as a nature of that, it gets a lot of very high traffic, particularly around very real-time data. So it needs to load up quickly, and we can't hold on the indexes very long and things like that. The project kicked off in the end of 2008 when the business decided that they want to go and start launching buy now products as well as the auction items. And that was a bit of a catalyst to go and redevelop their entire website. So we got to start from scratch and build a whole new website the way we wanted to. It actually runs on web forms, but today we'll be looking at a mix of, well, web forms and MVC in that the content we're covering is equally applicable to both. It has SQL 2005 behind it, Commerce Server, which is another Microsoft product, as well as Endeca, which is a Java search platform.
One of the things that we did in this project, we used Scrum for our project methodology. The project went over about 18 months. And one of the important things in using an agile methodology like that was determining what is your done definition. When you exit an iteration of development, what is it that you measure yourself against to say, yes, hand on heart, I've finished this feature, I shouldn't have to come back to it once again. When building public websites, this is probably a good starting base to think about when defining your own done criteria. Ours were XHTML compliance, and we're going to talk about that later on today. Something called the wave test, which we'll talk a little bit about as well, that has to do with accessibility of your website. We needed to have a certain amount of code coverage that was achieved using unit testing. We were using web forms, as Tatham mentioned, so that posed some challenges for us. We had an initial browser support matrix of about 9 browsers, including Windows and on Mac, and it increased as during the project a number of major versions were brought out. These are probably still applicable today. iOS 6 to 7 and 8, the various Firefox flavors and Safari flavors, and then now Google Chrome as well, which seems to be rating. And certainly on this site, we were seeing increased traffic on a monthly basis for that browser. The last one is an interesting one there, non-JavaScript support. That actually wasn't officially a requirement until about the 3rd or 4th sprint, but it was actually at our bequest that became a requirement. We were very insistent that the site work for people who don't have JavaScript enabled. And there are a number of different reasons why you may not have JavaScript enabled. One of the biggest users of your website, search engines, generally don't have JavaScript enabled. So by building features without JavaScript support first, you will generally get a better experience when it comes to search engine indexing of those features of your site. The last point there is very important as well. You need to develop your own. We came up with that browser support matrix based on looking at data to do with the existing version of the site that was already in production when we started the project. So if you're building a site for a customer and they already have an existing site, make sure you do some mining over their web logs to get an understanding of the type of browsers that their particular user base is using, and don't just try and find some stats out on the interweb.
One of the other things that you'll notice is we're distinguishing public websites from things like intranet and internal sites. They really are a different set of skills. You're dealing with a much wider browser matrix. Even in an organization where you're not locked down to a standard operating environment, you'll have a smaller browser matrix. And you need to go and obviously have the biggest reach you can. Little quick primer on XHTML. It's a very misunderstood standard. XHTML is originally based on HTML 401. So it takes that set of tags and elements and how it works, and it adds XML conformance to it. So saying that tags need to be always closed. You can't just throw an image tag in and it sits on its own. The advantage of XML is that you get a much better parser experience. You can be much more restrictive, and it's much easier to validate, which I'll talk about shortly why a stricter standard is better. 1.0 came in 3 flavors, but 1.1 is only a single flavor. There is no 1.1 transitional or strict or anything like that. The big reason that we took an interest in XHTML is that it's what ASP.NET is currently geared to serve. So HTML5 will be coming down the track as that obviously gets more and more prevalent, but all the controls today are about churning out XHTML. We chose to use XHTML 1.1 because it's the latest and the most strict. That also meant, though, that we lost some elements like iframes and also target attributes on links. So we couldn't just go and say, this link opens in a new window using HTML. In some cases in the site where we had third parties who we needed to embed some of their stuff in our site and we couldn't change how that worked a lot, we did need to use an iframe still. So on those pages, we'd go and change the doc type to XHTML 1.0 transitional. So choose a base, target that for as much of the site as you can, but rather than going and breaking it and saying, oh, I'll just use an iframe here anyway, change the doc type for that page if you really have to. Another area to look at the moment, though, is increasingly XHTML5. So the sites we're starting on now, we're increasingly using HTML5. The doc type is backwards compatible. All the way down to IE6, you will get a standards mode rendering. It won't trigger quirks mode. One of the other things to note is that a lot of people are going, oh, hold on, XHTML is dead, so this whole XML thing's gone at last. HTML5 defines these are the tags and these are how they work in the sense that you have a paragraph and a div and so on. But it also defines 2 serialization modes in the spec. One is SGML, which is the standard sort of HTML style if you can just have floating tags that self-close and whatnot. And the second serialization is XML. So sometimes you'll see it written as X in brackets, XHTML5. So we would recommend to use the XML serialization of that still.
Let's go ahead and have a look at a demo of setting up your ASP.NET projects for serving strict mode XHTML. Now, the story has changed a little bit since we first did this because there's a whole bunch of new features in ASP.NET 4 that make this a lot easier than what it was in Visual Studio 2008. I assume most of you are still pretty much using Visual Studio 2008 and ASP.NET 3.5. Yep. Okay, so I'm going to quickly take you through what you need to do to set that scenario up, and then I'll also, as I'm talking, talk about what we've done in ASP.NET 4 to make this a little bit easier for you. So what I've got here is an example of the standard page template that you'll be presented with in a .NET 3.5 web application or website. You can see that the doc type is XHTML 1.0 transitional. And I want to go ahead and set up this site so that I can serve 1.0 strict or XHTML 1.1. The first thing I'm going to do then is I want to remove that doc type. One of the new features in Visual Studio 2010 is that I can now hit angle bracket X and I'm actually getting snippet help for these doc types. Previously I had to remember what these doc types were and I haven't met anyone who actually remembers what they are yet. So it's really nice that I can just do that now and I've got 1.1 as my doc type. Obviously you would generally be doing that in a master page so that you don't have to redo that in all your pages. One of the other things you might want to do is if you look up in the toolbar here, you'll see I've got a drop-down box that's currently set to XHTML 1.0 transitional. What this does is gives me design time or code editing time, syntax highlighting and validation of the markup that I've got in my page here. Note that it hasn't automatically changed to 1.1 based on the doc type that I chose. You need to change this separately. So if I come in here now and change that to 1.1, I'm now going to get little green squigglies under elements or attributes if they don't exist, or red ones if I'm using them inappropriately within this document for that particular schema. Next, I'm going to jump into my web.config file. Now, this is a ASP.NET 4 application, so my web.config file is really, really small. One of the other new features of ASP.NET 4 is that our web.config files have been drastically minified because we've pushed a lot of the base content up into the machine configuration files. Inside the system.web section down here, though, for .NET 3.5, I have to go ahead and add an element here. If I start typing XH, you'll see that there's an XHTML conformance element that I want to use down here. That has a mode attribute on it that I need to set to strict. By default in .NET 3.5 applications, that is set to transitional. And if you go ahead and try and validate your ASP.NET Web Forms applications against XHTML 1.0 strict or against XHTML 1.1, it's going to fail because the server tag that is emitted by ASP.NET is actually emitting attributes that are invalid under those doc types. So by changing that to strict, there are a number of other things that get changed as well. And we're now starting from a much better place in terms of our web forms application is concerned to get that conformance if we want to validate our documents.
This is equally applicable even in ASP.NET MVC land. Yes, you'll be using the HTML helpers a lot, but there are some cases where you still use the ASP.NET server controls if you're using the web forms view engine. And this affects this as well.
So one of the other things you'd want to do, now that we've set up a sort of a base and we're ready to go, we need to think about the markup that's being emitted by the server controls. There was a project that Microsoft released quite a while now on Codeplex called the CSS-friendly control adapters. I see some nods in the audience, which is really good because I hope a lot of you are using those today. To use those, I need to go and add a reference to my project here. And you can see I've already done this. It's CSS-friendly. You just download the source code from Codeplex. Don't download the release. The release hasn't been updated since 2007 and contains a whole lot of bugs and doesn't actually do a lot of the things that the source code actually does. The community has been continuing to contribute to this project after it was given to Codeplex by Microsoft, and you want to download the source code and actually compile it yourself. Once you've done that and you get a reference to CSS friendly, I just drop that into my references, and then the other thing I need to do is go and add an app browsers folder, and inside of my app browsers folder I can throw a browser definition file that is included in that project when I download it from Codeplex. In this case, the CSS-friendly adapters.browser file. I'm not going to go into why that works or how that works, but rest assured you need that there if you're going to do this. This is how it all happens. It makes the magic work. And what it means is that now when you go and drop a menu control on your form, it's going to render out using different tags and different class attributes and things like that make it easier for you to go and attach CSS using your tooling and that type of thing. Previously, ASP.NET 3.5 and earlier, we were rendering those things as tables. Now, in ASP.NET 4, we don't have to do any of this. If you're doing an ASP.NET 4 project from the ground up, if you upgrade a 3.51, this doesn't happen by default. You don't need to put this conformance mode tag into your web.config because strict is the default mode. You don't need to use the CSS-friendly adapters because the control rendering for all of the controls, or most of the controls, in the web forms platform now render much nicer markup with CSS classes that you can attach to in order to attach your own styling. There is a new attribute on the pages element in your web.config file that controls this, and this is the control rendering compatibility version. By default, that is set to 4 for new applications, but if you're updating from a 3.5, that will be set to 3.5. And the controls will continue to render just as they did under ASP.NET 3.5 so that your site doesn't break when you update it because all the pages are now rendering using different markup. One of the other things that you might want to do, or I would thoroughly recommend you do, is if you're choosing to go and use or target a doc type and you want to validate your documents in your web application during the build process and during the development process, there's some things you can do to leverage the unit test framework in Visual Studio and Team Build, such that if someone checks something in that breaks the compliance of your site in any way, you can have your build fail. You don't set XHTML validation, you don't set XHTML up at the beginning of a project and go, hey, we're XHTML valid, and then just continue on and never think about it again. This is something you have to bake into your development cycle, such that if someone does something where they break your validation, you get alerted very, very quickly, thus tightening that feedback loop, and you don't find those bugs later on. So what I've got here is another web page that's set to XHTML 1.0 transitional in this case, and I'm going to go ahead and change that to XHTML 1.1. And what I have is a unit test using a library that I've written called WebAssert that will let me spin up that page using the ASP.NET Development Server or Cassini, and that's thanks to this little attribute here, which is included in the Microsoft Unit Testing Framework. And I'm just saying, go and load that up, scrape the HTML, and then send that off to the World Wide Web Consortium's online validation service, and then parse the result to figure out whether this page is valid HTML or not. So if I run this, and internet connection willing, what we should see is that this is valid. It's passed. I've got my little green tick here to tell me that this is currently a valid page. If I go back to here and I play the developer who adds something to this page that is invalid, And the reason this is invalid is because I'm missing my alt tag off my image, and I'm actually getting a little green squiggly here to tell me that. I didn't want to do that one. Then I go back and run this again. And now it's failing, and it's telling me that I've now broken this. So if you attach this to your continuous integration build, the build would now be failing, and you can go in and fix that validation error right there and then. You do.
So I've got a web page I've built here. I was talking before about XML serialization. I've said XML's cool. That's from Damien and Tatham. Nothing wrong with that page, right? As a developer, my page works. I can check it in. If I look at the markup for that, though, anybody spot the issue there? XML person? There's an unencoded ampersand between our two names. Now, that hasn't been picked up at all. But if I went up to the validator, it would go and tell me. One of the things that we've found in a lot of the work we've done is that about 80% or so, like finger in the air, but I'm guessing about 80% of the failures we have with validation are actually just little XML issues, like you don't encode your ampersands and URLs. So one of the things that I can do is on the page directive, I can set the content type to application/XHTML plus XML. So this is now changing the MIME type that the document is returned with from the web server down to the browser. That actually makes a really key change to how this works. If I now go and refresh this page, it's going to say XML is cool, bang. Chrome there is now switched to using an XML parser instead of an SGML parser. So it expects the document to be valid and XML conformant. So we see the first node, XML is cool. As soon as it hit the next node that's broken, it's actually gone and thrown up an error there for us. If I jump in and look at this in IE, sometimes, right, that's not displaying my website anymore though, because now IE thinks that's an XML document in IE 8 and below. It's just going, well, I don't know how to render this XML, I'm missing a style sheet for it. So we have a little problem here, which is where we then lead into content type negotiation. If I open this up in IE 9 preview though that we saw yesterday, you'll see that it's now supporting the XML parser as well. They haven't written the code to actually render the error messages yet, but they are detecting the error messages. That will come soon. So how can we go and make this work in Internet Explorer still? What I'm going to do is grab that content type. I'm going to remove it off my page directive. If I jump into the code behind, and generally this would be in a master page or somewhere, I'm just going to store that in a constant, the MIME type, and I can say if request.acceptTypes contains that one. So when a browser makes a request up to a web server, it sends information about these are the MIME types that I support. As soon as I can spell string comparer. Now, if the browser is saying that it supports that MIME type, I'm then going to set the response.contentType to that one. So now if I build this project, in Chrome we'll still get our experience. There we go, it's reloaded. So we've still got our XML validation. I've got some issues on my machine about it holding onto the parsers. This is not the normal case. And now IE is still showing the page. Now you can actually go and run this all the way through to your production site and do this over the web. And technically if you're using XHTML, you are meant to be using this MIME type. Sometimes though, just being pragmatic, you may not want to do that because it means when you get one character wrong, your entire page does blow up. We run this back through our development environments. So we put this code into our application and then we switch it on and off just using config. So in our development, test, and UAT environments, we have it turned on. And in staging and production, we just stick with text HTML. And this here, for the developer experience, surfaces these issues even earlier. So as soon as you screw up that ampersand or miss a closing tag, do a copy paste or something, you know about it before you even go and fail the continuous build. Now, sometimes though, we're not always in control of all of the markup. We write a lot of the markup, but sometimes we're pulling markup in from other places. In the case of the e-commerce site, because they had quite high value items, some of the auctions would go for up to $500,000, $600,000, $700,000. They wanted to have really rich descriptions on those products. Now, because the old website was classic ASP and everything that came along with that, the way this used to work, well actually still works, is the sales coordinators jump into Word, they go and write up their description and format it, and then they copy and paste that into front page. They go to the source tab, they copy that, and they paste it into the database for us. And then we're expected to put that on the page. We didn't. We also didn't want their formatting that came with it. So one of the things we wrote is this markup sanitizer. In the top text box, as I start typing, I've just got an opening P tag. Nothing's in the bottom. As soon as I type some text, it's closing that P tag for me automatically. If I go and do something like a TD element, it knows that a TD needs to be in a TR that needs to be in a table, so it's enforcing all the nesting for me. If I go and use an ampersand, it's encoding that entity for me. Now, the other thing we had is that sometimes these would be traditional auctions where people actually had to turn up and go and bid throwing their hand up in the air, or people wanted to be able to inspect it. So they wanted to be able to just go and embed Google Maps, which has, on Google, you go and copy the embed code, it has an iframe. Or they'd want to be able to just embed a YouTube video. Now, iframes in particular, we mentioned before that they're not in XHTML1.1. You'll see here it says XHTML1.1 in the middle. As soon as I type an iframe and say source equals, as soon as I close that tag, it's kept the iframe, but it's now spitting out XHTML 1.0 transitional. And we would actually flick our page back to 1.0 transitional. So even though you're still looking at product.aspx, depending on which product you look at, we serve you a different doc type, just based on what this is spitting out. This is actually all open source. It sits up on Codeplex, and the link will be up at the end. So you can just go and grab this and use it for free. So why do we care about all this? As developers, it's great fun to sit there and get the little, yes, the validator says green. It's good. It's kind of like that resharper effect of having a little green circle in the corner. But it all comes back to reach. Particularly as we're going and building public websites, we're dealing with lots of different users. Now, reach has a few different components to it. We've got a very wide heterogeneous environment of clients. We've got iPhones, we've got Windows Phone 7 series, you've got your desktop PCs and your laptops. Sorry, they're all the devices. Then all your clients, we on Grays Online got up to supporting something like 14 or 15 browsers in our current matrix, and we revisit that every month or two because that's how often it changes, and we need to go back and make sure we're supporting the right ones and dropping support for ones that have declined. There's also the various technologies. So we've already seen today, and I'm sure everyone's familiar with stuff that works in IE and doesn't work in Firefox or other way around or whatever. Finally, you've got a whole series of different connections as well. You've got users who've got broadband, narrowband. Even in a country like America, where we can consider that broadband is quite prevalent and available, sometimes you'll still get your GPRS Edge connection. Thank you, AT&T or T-Mobile. So how do we go and support all of these people? Standards are the way we do it. Standards give us that common base where we can say, right, this is an understanding of what should work across all these browsers. As a developer, one of the things that I've found is that if you jump into IE first, or even some of the other browsers, but more so IE, and you just start developing away with whatever works, there's usually 2 or 3 ways to do things. 2 of those will be some proprietary way, which they added in as experimental, and 1 will be the standardized way that eventually ended up back in there. If you stick to the standards, you're most likely to get the support across all the browsers. Now, how did this work out for us on Grays? Obviously, as new browsers came into the matrix, we needed to test them, but we didn't actually have a lot of effort to go and support any new browsers. And we actually managed to get this pretty cool video, which was after 12 months on the project of...
We have audio.
I have no idea how that sound is coming out. After 12 months on the project of not testing at all, we went and fired it up on a Nintendo Wii, and it worked. Now, the search button's fallen out of place a little bit on the text box, but otherwise you can go and navigate the site and buy stuff with no extra effort from us, which we thought was pretty cool.
Okay, thank you. Is Michael here? Michael recorded that video for us. No, he's not here. He didn't make it this morning. Okay. I want to talk to you about where you need to target yourself as a developer when talking about standards versus browsers. Tatham mentioned in that previous slide that our experience has been that if you're trying to build a website and you're doing it in Internet Explorer, perhaps you were an internet developer beforehand, that's certainly where I came from, you might build a bunch of features and get them working in IE, and then someone says, okay, well now you have to make that work in Firefox, and then you sit there, start looking at your code and looking at your front-end information and start wondering, why is it that this works so well in IE and just completely doesn't work in any other browser? In order to avoid that situation, what you want to do was make sure that you set your baseline for the standards that you're going to use, and that very much has to be over to the left-hand side of this chart. On the right-hand side, we're going to see a list of browsers in a moment. We don't want to target a minimum browser set in our browser support matrix. The browser support matrix is much less about what browsers we're targeting and much more about what browsers we're testing in. When it comes to setting what we're targeting, we want to set our baseline based on this left-hand side over here. Now, as you can see at the top of this chart, we have technologies that allow us to build features that have a nicer experience, and they're generally much newer technologies. The ones at the bottom give us much better reach because they're older and they're supported by many more browsers. This is generally the baseline that we set. It's just above CSS 2.1, and what that means is that browsers above that baseline just work. And we can see over here on the right-hand side, we've got a list of browsers that roughly corresponds to the various technologies that they support on the left-hand side. Browsers below that line, we still need to support a lot of the time, especially that bottom browser there on the right-hand side. And they need some specific attention. We do have to do workarounds for those browsers because they're not going to work straight out of the box because they don't support all of those standards. When we want to take advantage of technologies that are above that line, because I'm certainly not saying that you shouldn't be using those, we want to offer a better experience to those users who do have the support for those technologies. And a lot of the time, the vast majority of your users will be above that line, but you'll still have 25 or 30% of people underneath that line. So you want to leverage those technologies. We need to do that using a technique called progressive enhancement. Now, I'm hoping that a lot of you have heard of progressive enhancement already and perhaps are practicing it today, and I'm going to show you a demonstration shortly of a practical application of that. When we need to fall back and do workarounds to work for older technologies, we call this graceful degradation. Now, five years or so more ago, when we were talking about supporting lots of browsers on the web, we used the term graceful degradation a lot. A lot of the time, we would target a browser, and we would say, this browser supports these standards, and we would write our stuff, and then we'd say, okay, they come along this browser, we need to gracefully degrade and give them some type of experience. These days, we've kind of flipped that around. We like to talk about building on a very solid base of core standards that a lot of browsers support. And that goes right down to as low as HTML. If the browser doesn't support anything else and all the person can see is HTML, they should be able to use your site. And remember, one of the biggest and most important users of your site, search engines, only look at the HTML that gets generated by your site. And then we progressively enhance functionality on top of that by layering on CSS, JavaScript, and then maybe plugins on top of that again if you want to add those type of features. Okay. I'm going to switch over here, and I want to give you a quick demonstration of what I mean by progressive enhancement. So this is the search results page for Grays Online as it is today. And I've got this open in Firefox, and what I'm going to do is go ahead and completely disable JavaScript and refresh this page. I mentioned before that we had to support non-JavaScript as a scenario. There are numerous reasons for doing this. How many people use a JavaScript blocking technology in their browser or browse the web without JavaScript turned on? Does anyone still do that? A few people with their hands up. So even in a room here at a conference where we're all web geeks, there are people who browse the web without JavaScript turned on. They only enable JavaScript for specific sites. Then there's a whole category of users that you have to use assistive technologies, and a lot of the time those assistive technologies don't work all that well with JavaScript. And then we have the search engine stuff that I mentioned. So let's have a look at what still works. If I hover over these menus, we'll see that this all still works even though I don't have JavaScript enabled. And that's because these are completely CSS-driven menus. There is a graceful degradation thing that we had to do to make these work in IE6 and IE7. There's a tiny bit of JavaScript that has to run in those browsers, but for everybody else, these are a pure CSS menu. If we hover over these links over here, you'll notice at the moment, pay attention, there's no image on the right-hand side of these. It's just a little blank space. And if I click on that, it just takes me through to my shopping cart page. That all seems fairly simple. But if I go back and I now enable JavaScript and I refresh this page,
A wonderful 200 milliseconds from here to Sydney.
Yeah, latency. And I click that now, we see we're getting a nice in-page experience that I've attached via jQuery and using the magic of jQuery and some nice CSS to give me this nice experience because I have JavaScript enabled. That's a really, really simple example of progressive enhancement where I've added features on top when JavaScript was detected. Also note that I've sort of lit up these little buttons that are available here to indicate to the user that there's something that's going on. The way that we did that is if we have a look at the source, and I'm just going to zoom in to this top line here. There we go. Okay, so we look at the body tag there. We'll see that by default it has a class of no-js. What that means is that in my CSS, I can create rules that create UI that only apply to users who don't have JavaScript enabled. You'll see the very first thing after the body tag is an inline script element, which usually I would frown upon greatly, but it's the only way to achieve this properly. That all it does is says get elements by tag name body, find the first one in that, and set its class name to JS. So the very first thing that happens on this page if the user has JavaScript is I flip the class in the body tag from Node.js to JS, which means before anything has started rendering, the CSS engine is now going to use those rules instead of the Node.js rules, so I don't get any flash of content after the page is loaded when my JavaScript handlers go and attach themselves, and then maybe I change UI that way. So using that technique, we can get a really nice experience for non-JavaScript users and JavaScript users.
You doing it?
No.
Oh. Jump ahead. Is it still you?
Oh, it's still me, sorry. There is actually a color-coded marker in the bottom of these slides, and I keep having to remember I'm green and Tatham's red. So let's just recap on what we've talked about. It's important to set yourself a browser support baseline. Browser support, from your matrix point of view, is very much what you're testing. Try and make sure that you set your baseline towards the standards that you want to target as web developers. I really implore you to use CSS layouts. Who's still using tables to lay out their pages? Come on, you can put your hands up.
Is anyone going to admit to it? Oh, there we go.
There we go. Okay. Yeah. How do you get people away from that?
They're like, oh, this is just great. I can adjust, especially in Visual Studio 2008, you can adjust the tables.
Right.
Make it look pretty and all that stuff.
Violence works really well, I find. Yeah. You have to, it all comes down to explaining the benefits, I guess. There is a large learning curve involved in moving to CSS layout if you're not particularly a front-end person.
If they are attached to the design experience, you might want to have a look at Expression Web, because it allows you to take things like a div and go and resize that, and it will actually update the width of that back in the CSS file separate to the document, because it tracks the styles.
Yep. So there are lots of benefits to CSS layouts. They do load quicker. There's a better caching story because you're not having to send down all this layout HTML over and over and over again. I think they're much easier to maintain. If you've ever built up your complex layout in a table and then the customer says, well, actually, I want that over there now, you sit there going, oh, God, I've got 100 nested tables and I have to figure out which cell and cold span and row span I need to do that in. Tooling makes that a little bit easier, but it's still not a very nice experience. And you get the best support for the majority of users. Progressively enhanced from a standards compliant base, that's what we've just shown you, and try and build your non-JavaScript functionality first. It is not twice the work to build non-JS and then build JS. When we were breaking down our features during our scrums at the beginning of our sprints, we would always create a non-JavaScript story and a JavaScript story, and the non-JavaScript story always had higher priority. Why? Because if we don't get time to do the JavaScript story, at least we have something that functions for everybody. Everybody who uses our site can use the non-JavaScript story. Most of the time what you'll find is that the JavaScript version requires almost all of the stuff you built in the non-JavaScript version anyway. You require most of the scaffolding of the HTML that's there. You generally require the server-side get and post responses. If you're going to be making AJAX calls, you'll need those for the non-JavaScript story as well.
Well, even in the case of the mini carts, Damien was just showing, the link still has to be up there at the top. So that's just a link to the cart summary page, but then that's what we attach the jQuery to. So we had to put that there anyway.
Done.
Done. Oh, there we go. One of the other parts of Reach is accessibility. So we've touched a little bit on people who use assistive technologies. This is a whole massive topic in its own right, not even a session of its own. There's entire conferences on accessibility. I don't profess to understand all of it, and a lot of the times you won't be able to get up to speed on all of it either. There's just so much content. So what we need to do is have a bit of an understanding of what the goals are and how to be pragmatic about it. The WAI is the Web Accessibility Initiative. That's the W3C who actually go and sit down and think about what do we need to do to achieve accessibility. And some of the outputs of that are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which now has 2 versions. 1.0 is very specific about, in HTML, you must have this attribute on these tags to be accessible. WCAG 2 is a little bit of a step back. It says, in a technology which uses images, you must have a way of describing the title of the image. So it has then a separate set of guidelines which describes how to implement this into HTML or how to implement this for PDF and so on. Now, the reason that these are relevant varies a bit country to country, but definitely in Australia, our federal government has actually just ratified WCAG 2 last month, and they're requiring that all of their government websites be WCAG 2 by 2012, and it actually also falls under our Disability and Discrimination Act. You actually open yourself to litigation in Australia if you don't meet this, and that's quite common through a lot of countries. It's also just something that's not hard to do. Writing good markup helps with things like CSS layouts and search engine optimization and so on, and particularly if you're supporting the non-JavaScript story. WAI ARIA is about accessibility for rich internet applications, so that's about things like Silverlight and Flash and so on. There's a separate set of guidelines for them to be aware of if you're using those technologies. And finally, there's WebAIM. WebAIM is an independent organisation who provide actual pragmatic advice on how to go and do this. So WCAG 2 is this ginormous standard. Well, it's a simplification of one, but it's still ginormous. WebAIM sit there and say, well, hold on, what can we actually implement in the browsers that are there today? What's actually feasible to achieve and affordable in a development story? And they actually published the Wave accessibility tool, which is similar to the HTML validator. You take your URL, you whack it in, you hit go, and it will churn out a series of errors and warnings and manual checks for you to do and say, hey, go and check this element. Are you doing this here? And so on.
And we actually had that built into our build process as well. So very similar to what I showed you in a unit test before. We would take the same page, send it up to the Wave accessibility tool for a lot of our key pages, and the build would fail if you failed the Wave test.
So getting back into markup, because all of this is coming back to markup at the end of it. Our CSS, our JavaScript, everything sits on top of that, and accessibility is also largely driven by it as well. A little bit of a pop quiz. Who can tell me what the ASP server label control renders? There we go. So most people said span, but there's also, if you go associated control ID equals and you point it at like a text box, it changes to start rendering an HTML label control. What about panel? Div. Aha, you didn't pick up on this one. It's usually a div. If you put grouping text on it, it becomes a field set with a legend in it. Now, you need to understand this if you're using these server controls. They came from the days when Microsoft said, right, we want to get all these Visual Basic and WinForms developers and just push them onto the web. So it's all drag and drop. That's great. But these days, you need to understand what those controls are actually rendering. Go and have a look at the source that they spit out and look at the other attributes on them and how you can change them. You also need to be aware of some of the things that don't work very well in them. So, for example, a panel has an enabled attribute on it, which is a really easy way of just going, oh, if I set that to disabled, all the controls go disabled. But it also writes out a div that then goes disabled on it, which isn't even disabled equals disabled. It's just disabled. So it's not even valid XML, let alone a valid attribute in any standard today. And it doesn't work in most of the browsers anyway. So there are some things that you need to avoid. The other one is, do you even really need the server control? I want to have a look at some code we've got here. ASP.NET has a server form, as everyone would know, in web forms, and it only supports one of them. That doesn't mean we're locked to one form, or that it's necessarily a great idea. So the top one here is a ASP server-side text box and an ASP button. Say I type in some text if I want to do a search for MIX10, and I press enter. That there has gone and triggered a server-side postback. In the net panel at the bottom, we can see that it did a post. The URL didn't change. It's still default.aspx. So if we were actually building a search page on our site and a user wants to go and copy that link and email it out to someone, they can't do it. Think about all the search engines out there. They go to another page. So we could go and redirect them to search results.aspx or something, but then we post up, we 302 across, we send that down, we get up, and then we just bad idea. The bottom one here, I'm using a series of client controls. If I go and type some text in here of MIX10, that's gone and done a GET request to, okay, zooming doesn't work so well over a remote desktop, has done a GET request to search ASPX, so on. So now we've got that shareable URL. If we look at the markup behind this, it's quite simple. The first one is our server form, and the other one's the client form that sits outside of it. Don't be afraid to just use a client form tag sometimes. They work really well. And they also give you benefits of things like the default button works. So in that case there, if I press enter in the first text box, the right submit button gets hit. If I press enter in the second one, the right submit button gets sent. Particularly where we have sites where we have things like a login box up the top and maybe a register box and so on, we then currently, or previously, you'd go and do an ASP panel and you'd say default button equals, and it renders some inline JavaScript on a div, which is just ugly. And then if you put some grouping text on it, then who knows what happens. So it's just not a good idea. And you can usually solve this with forms. The other big advantage of these is you can use lots of them. So you can go and get off to different pages. How does this work in a master page scenario though? So if I go and create my typical master page, the first thing it gives us is a server form with a content placeholder in it. Now, in each of my pages, I'm stuck inside that form. I can't go and put another form in there because then you've got nested forms, and that's a whole other problem. We don't want to move the server form, or we don't want to take it out of the master page and have to put it in each of our client pages though, because some things like the ASP script manager, which is really quite useful, we want to have that in our master page, and it has to sit in the server form. So the technique that I use is I get rid of this annoying div. I rename this placeholder to server form placeholder. Yep. And then master pages support multiple content placeholders. I move this one out and I say no form placeholder. So now, when I go and create a content page, I have two different content regions that I can target. I can opt into the server form, or I can just say no, I'm going to control those forms myself. And I can make that decision on a page-by-page basis. The server form is always there, so other controls like the script manager can still register into it. Everything still works.
And of course, you can get more complicated than this. In Graze, we actually had a series of nested master pages. So we had a root master page that had no server form whatsoever, and then another part master page that inherited from that and added a server form. So that if we had particular pages where we really needed to control exactly where the server form was, we could do that just for those pages.
Now, all these client controls are great, but sometimes they can get a little bit fiddly. One example of that is, say I want to show a drop-down list, I want to data bind the selected value to it. Now, in MVC, you go HTML dot and everything, but we're not in that land right now, and I don't want to go and write all this ugly code to admit the HTML as string stuff or something. So I'm actually going to use an ASP.NET drop-down list. With ASP.NET 4, I can go and set the client ID mode to static, so now when I set an ID on it, say I do zone or something for the search, it is going to use that same ID all the way down as the client ID. Now, though, we can go and put a list of items in it and bind against it. All works nicely, right? If I save this and I go and run this up in the browser, the whole page just blew up. And that's whinging that I moved that drop-down list outside the server form. Because ASP.NET is geared to always having that form there, it's trying to help us out and say, hold on, you've got this in the wrong place. There's actually a really easy way to fix that, though. Unfortunately, it's just not discoverable. If I jump into the code behind for my page and I say override, there's, normally I would type V, but my plugins are not cooperating. There's an entry here which is verify rendering in server form. So what happens when you get a control that needs to, that expects to be in a server form, it calls up to the page and says, hey, make sure I'm in a server form, please. And it passes that into this method. Now, instead of calling through the base implementation, I'm just going to put a blank method there. So now, when the control says, make sure I'm in that server form, nothing's going to happen. We don't have to return true or false, we just don't throw an exception. So if I go and build this, refresh in my browser again, and now under the click me button there, we've got a really squashed drop-down list because I didn't put anything in it. So you can still go and use those server controls in your client forms. You don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And there you're on layout.
Sweet. So while we're still on the topic of forms, I want to quickly talk about form layout. Forms are fundamental to good websites, especially commerce sites. Some of the most important interactions with your customers generally involve some type of HTML form. They're filling in their details, they're hopefully giving them their credit card number, and then hitting submit in order to buy your goods and services. So it's absolutely imperative that you get these things right. The way that you lay out these forms, and when I'm talking about layout, I'm talking about what markup that you use to generate that form, affects the accessibility of the form, how easy it is to style that form using CSS and change it, and also the maintainability of that form. Who's still building their form layout with tables? Okay, I think that's actually more people than we're using tables for generic layout. I still see a lot of people using tables for form layout. Tables are inherently difficult to change, especially when you start getting complex forms, and then your customers start wanting to add and remove fields in particular areas of that form. They can be very, very annoying to keep up to date. So what I like to do is choose a consistent form layout model, the same markup that you use over and over again, and then stick to it for every single form that you use. Some of the examples. This is a common one you'll find. I've got my field set to denote a group of fields that are inside my form, and then for every single field, I've got a div element. I'm classing it as a field, so I can attach style sheets and JavaScript to that if I need to. And then for each one of those, I've got another class to denote which field it is, first name, last name, etc., etc. I've got a label tag inside each one that points to the associated input field or select box or whatever it is inside that form. And then right down the bottom, I've got an action, in this case, which is just a single submit button. Another derivative of that is using a paragraph tag. You'll see this in a lot of the ASP.NET MVC examples. They use paragraph tags for these. Now, we could argue over the semantics of whether a paragraph is technically the right thing to use if all you're showing is a label and a box next to it, but we're not going to do that today. I'm going to show you my preferred layout paradigm, which is using an ordered list. So if we look at the semantic meaning of these tags, what is a form if it isn't just a list of fields you want the user to fill in? Generally, starting at the top, working the way to the bottom, and then hitting some action at the bottom. HTML forms tend to emulate what we had in the paper world before and what we still have today. In the Western world, we start at the top left-hand corner, we work our way across and down the form to the bottom right-hand corner or the bottom where we sign it. So an ordered list is a really, really good paradigm from that point of view. The other thing it's great for is that it gives us a lot of structure in our HTML that we can now attach to using CSS, using element selectors, and also JavaScript. So now we can use jQuery with CSS selectors to attach extra behavior to this form using that progressive enhancement type technique that we talked about before. So I have an ordered list as my overall container, and then for each element, it goes into an LI, for each field, sorry. I don't need to label them as fields anymore because I have an LI tag I can use to attach to, and then I have my submit button down the bottom. So if I want it to look like what I have in the top left-hand corner here, a standard field set with my field labels left aligned and then my form fields over on the right and then my button underneath it lining up with the left-hand side of all my form fields, that's an example of the type of CSS I would have to use. We've got some floats in there, we've got setting some margins and clearing some padding and things like that. A couple of changing the display type. The label is now a block element instead of an inline element, and I get this nice layout. Without changing my markup, I can add a little bit more CSS, and now I've right-aligned my form fields, my labels, sorry. So if those label names were larger, they'd now be tailing out on the left-hand side rather than the right-hand side. And there are some various studies and whatnot that have gone into which type of layout is best for what type of form. And there were some great sessions at last year's Mix about this, and I believe there was one this year as well. And here's another layout using the exact same markup. I've now got the labels directly above each of the form fields as I go through, and my button down the bottom is completely left aligned with all of my form fields as well. A little bit more CSS, same markup, I have a totally different layout. And the last one is something you might see for a short form or a search form. I've got them floated next to each other as an inline set of forms. Elements. Again, same markup. I haven't had to change my code, essentially. I've just had to change my UI presentation logic, that is my CSS, to get a fundamentally different layout from the same markup. Yeah? So if you want to get really complex, you can always revert to absolute positioning. So you can create a container that has its position set to something that when you do absolute positioning inside of that, they're positioned relative to that container. So if you're used to the drag and drop type of experience and you've got access forms that are really complex and you're moving those into a web type scenario, you can use that. If you're doing multi-column and multi-row, you can, if it's always going to be 3 columns of fields all the way through, you can decorate these things with extra classes to denote columns, or you can just set, for instance, the LI, you would set the width of the LI to be 33%. And then you're always going to get 3 columns, and they're just going to continue wrapping down all the way. And if the user resizes the browser, they're just going to get bigger and smaller if you're inside a container that's going to do that. Right. So that still works. So if you just float them, if you float them all and you have individual widths set for each field in your CSS, that will continue to work. You may need to add some extra classes to denote what's an end of a line Or you can actually just attach CSS directly to like the last name field, if that's the last one, and then start clearing that so that the floats start going on to the next line after that field.
What is the best way to, I do like a BR and then I do a clear left, create a new row.
Right.
Is that correct?
We can take that offline. I can talk to you about that afterwards.
So another part of Reach that we talked about was the different connections that are out there, all the way down to GPRS still in the US. Client performance is how we go and expand the reach across all those different connections and give a suitable experience to everyone. And there's a whole topic in this itself. The big thing is go and grab YSlow. YSlow is a plugin for Firebug, which is a plugin for Firefox. You go to your website, you hit start, and it just goes and runs like 20 rules and gives you a grade on each of them, and then a grade overall, A, B, C, D, or I think it goes to F if you really screwed up. The key thing about YSlow is it's always right. Just assume that, and you get it green, do what it says, and you'll end up in a really good position. Unless you're in a really, really big website or you've got some strange scenario you need to solve or something like that, basically all of their rules will be valid. The key goal, though, is just to minimize requests. Every single time you go back to the server, that's a whole bunch of extra latency. You're reposting your cookies and all the request headers and all sorts of stuff. And browsers can only, most of the ones out there today, still only download 4 items at a time. So you might have a lot of stuff, even though the latency is really quick or low latency, you'll have stuff getting blocked up just waiting for other things to download. In your pages, you need to have the CSS at the top so that it can download this, or in the head, so that it can download the CSS first so that it always renders with the right styling. Otherwise, you get that flash of unstyled content. But you can put all your JavaScript references right at the bottom of the body. So that means it'll take the HTML, it'll render the page, and the user can start interacting with it. It'll go off and download the JavaScript, and when that's ready, it'll run the JavaScript and attach it. Now, this is another case for building that non-JavaScript story first, because if a user jumps into our site and does something really quick, they go and hit that mini cart button, they'll just end up on the cart summary page instead, but at least it gave them that action if, say, the JavaScript file never turned up. The web's a hostile place. You can't always assume that every download is going to work. Combining CSS, you need to do it build and deployment time. We have multiple CSS files in our development just so that it's easy to find stuff. We combine that at build time into a single one. The JavaScript, though, if you're using the ASP script manager, it can combine it for you on the fly. And then also using CSS sprites for images. Images are a huge area where you can get a lot of benefits of minimizing requests. In the interest of time, I'm going to jump over that, but if anyone's not familiar with sprites, come up and we can show you. Also, a lot of the content that you're pushing over the wire is going to be text-based. Images being binary are nice and fairly small, relatively for what they contain, but pushing lots of text over the wire is great for us developers. It's not great for the actual connections. Go and gzip that. It's NIIS, you turn on dynamic compression, and voila, it's working. And that'll go and cram down your pages quite a lot. You can get a huge saving out of that. In larger scenarios, you can quite often get load balancers that'll do it for you in front of the web servers as well. This is our CSS file for Grays, all jammed into one file, minified, all the white space removed, everything. Word was the only tool I could show it in to screenshot it because it was the only one I could zoom out enough to actually fit it. It's 38 pages and about 6 pages of red squiggly lines in. It gave me a message box saying that the spelling and grammar check was going to stop because it had found too many errors. Out of all of that, these are our hacks. You can almost read that on that screen. I can make out markers and stuff there. There's IE6, there's Firefox 2, there's IE7, there's Firefox 3, but those are our only browser-specific hacks because we built to the standards. We use standards-based rendering instead of quirks mode. We use the standard box model, all of that. We had minimal hacks. And many of these are that graceful degradation scenario. So things like showing a PNG 8 to IE6, where we'd use a PNG 24 everywhere else. So how do we go and combine all of this into this one file? In our build script, we use some PowerShell. This is not a PowerShell primer. You can download this script and it should just work for you. Basically what it's doing is just getting a folder, getting them all in alphabetical order, and then jamming them into one big text file. We do it in alphabetical order so that we have a consistent understanding of the precedence and what's going to override what in our files. And we'll usually have one of them called _base.css, so it always comes first. So that's where you put your generic sort of HTML font size, that sort of stuff that's just generic rule. The next thing we do is actually use the YUI compressor. Yahoo released a CSS compressor that removes things like comments, white space, redundant semicolons, stuff like that. And there's a C# port of that on Codeplex, which we can then call from PowerShell. So we do that first, and then we gzip it, and then it gets really nice and small.
So lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about quality in the last 5 minutes. Obviously, when you're building large sites and we're talking about getting as many people and many eyes on your site as possible, because the web is all about reach, quality becomes very, very important. I think quality is always important, but it becomes even more important if you're trying to sell things on your website. One of the ways that we can improve quality is through testing. Now, I mentioned that we used ASP.NET Web Forms on this project, and anyone who's tried to unit test web forms before will know that it's a whole lot of pain to go ahead and do that. And it wasn't until recent advances and other work that have been done by ASP.NET that this became a little bit easier. The types of tests that you might want to do are the 4 that are listed here. Unit tests. This isn't a testing session, so I'm not going to go into these in an awful lot of depth, but a unit test is code that tests other code. The code that you're testing is a very, very small unit, generally a single method with a single set of parameters for that particular test. And for testing other cases on that method, you would write more unit tests. An integration test is kind of the next level up. We now might be testing the interaction of 2 classes or 2 members together, but we're still writing code to test other code. A functional test is where we're actually testing what the user is going to do. If we need to automate this, we're now talking about browser automation technologies when we're talking about web applications. You want to be looking at frameworks like Watin, W-A-T-I-N. Selenium is another one that's very good. I believe Telerik have one now called WebEye. These are frameworks that allow you to, from your code in a unit test from the Visual Studio point of view, from a test, open up a new browser window, get access to the DOM so that you can interact with the page by clicking on elements, and then inspect that in order to determine whether the page is functionally working. So, for instance, for Grays, we had a series of dedicated testers on the project, and they wrote functional tests, whether they were manual, where there was a script they had to go and follow, or they were automated. It was C# code that opened IE on the build server, ran through a series of tests, and validated whether the site worked as intended. The advantage of that is it actually tests JavaScript, of course, as well, because you're testing interaction with the browser. And the last type of testing you'll probably want to do is performance testing as well, depending on the size of your site. And there are various technologies that we offer in order to facilitate that type of testing as well.
So we mentioned about testing web forms. We did a lot of work in this space to go and make it easier for us to do, so it was quick and therefore part of our development process. And in order to do that, we used a model view presenter architecture. This is not a new architecture, but we went and wrote a library that applies this to web forms. We've released that as open source. It's on webformsmvp.com. And this week is when we're cutting version 1 and pushing that up. It's been in development for about 12 months in its current state. It's used on a number of high-profile websites. We serve about 10 million hits a day through it at the moment across all of them. So it's nice and tested and stable. And it's also it's evolved out of a number of previous projects we've been on. So we're pretty happy with the architecture of it. The key goals to it were that it's additive. So you can add this to an existing web forms project today. Even if you're doing new development in MVC or something like that, you've probably still got a web forms app somewhere, and you can start to use this library one feature at a time throughout your site. You don't need to go and rewrite your site. You don't need to make these sweeping changes, and it's even great for new sites. It facilitates a good architecture. So yes, you can build MVP yourself in web forms, but this just makes it a little bit easier. It wires up presenters and things like that for you. Finally, it adds a few new features that just aren't in web forms at all either. I'm going to do a quick demo just to show you how this actually helps us. Here I've got a page. I've passed n equals 1 into the query string, and it just says the number 1 is odd. If I feed in n equals 2, it says the number 2 is even. The code for this is quite simple. The home page, we have a user control, math. The math control, we have a label on it with just an ID. And in the page load for that control, we have some code that goes out, grabs it off the query string, does the calculation, and sets the text back onto the label. Now, we can't unit test this because we can't go and run up the user control and fire the load event without a runtime. So the first thing I've done is I've got a logic project up in my solution. I want to move as much of the code as I can up into that logic project, and that's going to be our unit testable code. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a reference into the existing application to the Web Forms MVP DLL. It's a single bin deployable DLL that works in medium trust, so it'll even work in shared hosting scenarios. Now in my logic project, I'm going to create a class which I'm going to call mathpresenter.cs. So this is where the logic's going to live. I need to make that public so I can access it from the other one. it's going to inherit from presenter of iView of math model. This looks a bit gnarly to start with. Presenter is the base class we provide, and you'll see why that's helpful in a second. iView is describing the interface that segregates the view from the logic, and that's what makes it testable. And math model is very similar to, if you're used MVC at all, having a strongly typed view data. So this is how we're going to pass the message back down to the markup. So I'm just going to put a string in here called message, just with a get and a set. And that's that entire class done. Now I need to implement a constructor, which resharp or Alt-Enter does it for me. What happens in an MVP model is that the view doesn't know about the logic. It just exposes the hooks that it needs. The presenter, when it gets created, will get handed an instance of the view. And you'll see here that it's an iView of math model. It's not the actual user control. And this is so that we can mock it for unit testing. In here, I'm going to subscribe to the view.load event. Now, this is exactly the same load event that you get in ASP.NET. All we're doing is proxying it up to you in the presenter. I also need to release from that event in the current build so that we don't get a memory leak. In a future build, you won't need to do that. So now we've got this load event. We've written a little bit of boring code, but it was pretty quick. How do we actually go and use it? If I jump in the code behind for my control, this is the code we want to unit test. I'm just going to cut that code, go and paste it straight into the load event in the presenter. You'll see it basically all worked except for the reference to that message label, because we're trying to separate our UI from our logic. So how do we get that message back down? That's what we created the model class for. If I go view.model.message, I can go and put the text in there. That's my presenter done. In the user control, back in the code behind, I'm going to delete that event handler altogether. I'm just going to update this to inherit from MVP user control of type math model. That's, and I need to put an attribute on here which just says go and use the math presenter for this. We have a feature that's about to land, which means you won't even need to use that attribute. It'll find it based on the convention of the name. So the final thing is I need to actually get that text into my markup now somehow. I've got the label control here with an ID. What I'm going to do is instead of using that ID, I'll still use the label control so I get the encoding. I'm going to use a binding syntax and go model.message. And I'm actually getting full IntelliSense there because it's strongly typed all the way through to the markup. Same as MVC with typed view data. Now if I go and build that, run my application is functionally exactly the same. There's no difference. I didn't even have to change the page where I use that control. The result for us as a developer now, though, is I can go and create a unit test project that I've got down here, and I can actually go and write a test. So here, I've gone and mocked the request because it's HTTP request base. I can jump in and actually say request.stub. When somebody asks for the query string, return a name value collection which has n equals 1 in it. And I need an extra pair of braces there. I'm also mocking the HTTP context, saying when somebody asks for the request, return that mock request. Now, the actual acting, the next thing I now do is I just get the presenter. Create the view. Because we don't want to actually run our UI in this. So I'm going to generate a stub of iView of math model. Get some more references in there. There we go. And now when I create my presenter, I can actually just go new math presenter, because this is the code we're testing, and pass in that mocked view. To act on it, on the view, I raise the view load event. And this is, I'm using RhinoMox as my mocking framework here. And then in the actual assert, now all I can do is just go assert.r equal I expect a message, say it would be odd, and then I can go and just get that out of the view model. Now, this test isn't quite going to work because I haven't got the message right and so on, but it demonstrates that I can do the arrangement, I can act, and I can assert against it. So I can run a whole series of unit tests that even go and mock things like what's happening in the query string.
We have to move on because we're over time.
Yep.
So, takeaways from this. Web standards make accessibility, reach quality, and maintenance easier. ASP.NET is geared to serving XHTML today, but you need to do a little bit of developer awareness and a little bit of tweaking to make that happen. HTML5 is coming, so put it on your radar. Determine your done criteria early and automate your testing and your quality checking as much as possible. And ensure quality by using testable patterns like Tatham has just demonstrated that let you use dependency injection, inversion to control, and things like unit testing to help bring that quality bar up. Here's a bunch of resources. There's my blog, Tatham's blog. World Wide Web Consortium is a great place to go and learn about these standards, w3.org. Webformsmvp.com if you want to look at that unit testable web forms. The markup sanitizer that Tatham demonstrated that automatically sanitizes your markup to make sure that it is XHTML compliant. And the website we showed you today was www.graysonline.com. Please fill in your evals. Thank you very much for voting us in to talk to you today through the call for content, and I hope you have a great mix.
Thank you.